Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. I hope that you have had a great first week back at school and that things are going as smoothly as can be expected at this point in time. So remembering that we are all still adjusting to getting back into school, we are adjusting to our new routines of being back at work and maybe our tired feet from being up all day. And if you hear the clicking behind me, that's because I've got a little four-legged friend visiting me on the floor over here who likes to sleep in her bed right there. So if you hear the clicking, that's what that is for. But I wanted to talk today about teaching writing. And this is something that has totally transformed for myself over my teaching career so far. And I've completely changed how I teach for the better. And I want to be able to share what I'm doing in my classroom with you to give you an alternative perspective to maybe answer some of those frustrations, because maybe you're just like me and you are frustrated with your writing program, or you're frustrated with feeling like you need to pull teeth with your students to get them to write or to engage in the process of writing. So this was me. I was teaching writing, and I had a whole lot of students that were coming into me and their previous teacher said, good luck, they hate writing and refuse to do it. And I dreaded it. And I thought over the summer, what am I going to do to get these kids to write for me so that I'm not constantly fighting with them to get them to write something? I mean, every kid has something to say and they all have something to share and contribute. I mean, kids, especially in junior, are developing their opinion and they're quite opinionated. And I was seeing that in science and social studies. And I wondered to myself, why is that not coming through in their writing? When I took a hard look at what I was doing, what I actually realized I was doing was I was following a fairly traditional approach to teaching writing. So I would pick a writing form that I would want to teach, or that might have been suggested in some of the curriculum documents in those example sections of the curriculum. I thought, well, if it's part of the example text, why not teach it? So I pick one of those writing forms. I would plan out that 6-week unit for my students to teach, and I would go ahead and teach them everything they needed to know about that writing form, and then I'd set them off to task to write within that writing form. Pretty technical. And I would focus during my lessons on the process and the features and the techniques of writing within that writing form, like an adventure or a fairy tale. And students would do it. Well, most of them would do it, but so many of them hated it. And I would just get dull and uninspired pieces of writing. And at the same time, these are the same kids that are saying, well, I write at home, or their parents are saying they write all the time at home. They're really creative. They're really creative writers. And I just simply wasn't seeing it at school. So what they were capable of or showing other places in their life was certainly not translating into my classroom and getting them to write. So I needed to make a change. So before we get into that, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me tonight. And if you are new to Teaching with Inquiry Live, well, hello, and thank you for joining me. My name is Patty, and I am a junior grade teacher here in Ontario, Canada, and I come live every single Monday night to talk about using inquiry-based teaching practices in your junior classroom. And I'm also the teacher blogger behind madlylearning.com, and I just like to share all of the things that I'm doing in my classroom and things that I am working on and growing as a teacher in hopes that it might save you some time down the road, as I've already done some of that legwork for you. So it is my hope that by sharing, I might be able to save you some of that time going forward. So that's why I'm here. So let's talk about writing and why I talked about why I needed to change. So what did I change about my writing program? Well, I really looked at the 3 separate components that I wanted to change about my writing program. Number 1, my writing program needed to focus less on me and what I wanted to do, and it needed to focus on student-centered approach to learning and teaching. So I really needed to flip that script, in so to say. I needed to flip it so that I was not centered into what we were doing in my classroom, but I was allowing students to be in control and have some autonomy over what they were writing. So giving them that voice and choice and being student-centered. Number two, I stopped focusing on the technicalities of writing within certain writing forms, and I took a couple of steps back and I focused more on the writing process. The writing process that is generally fairly universal regardless of what specific writing form you're writing. And we focused a little bit less on the specific writing forms and more in a broader sense on categories. And finally, the last is I knew that my students needed way more time than what a unit could give them. So my units were typically 6 to 8 weeks, and it simply wasn't enough time for students to show mastery, especially because I had students from every different writing level on the planet. So there was no two students that were really writing at the same level, and I couldn't really push a couple of people forward or get a universal kind of accepted idea of what our general next steps were going to be, because student A's next steps were going to be totally different from student B's next steps. So I really had to look at implementing a far more differentiated approach and giving my students more time. So I want to dig in on those three components. So the first is a student-centered approach to writing. I was finding myself in the past, I was making all the decisions, and that's why my students were disengaged. Schooling has changed and our kids have changed. Their lives have changed. If you've got kids yourself, try giving them the idea that television doesn't happen on demand or that they can't binge watch shows. With the invent of Amazon Prime and Netflix, this is a generation that has control and say over what they want to watch when they want to watch it. They have access to their answers immediately. So if they have a question they want to know the answer to, they have access to it immediately. They have a lot of choice in their life, even at a very young age. So when we turn and send them into school and all of a sudden tell them that no longer do they have choice, but they just need to sit and consume, that's a really difficult switch. And it's kind of antiquated because it's not the reality of the world that they're living in. We are changing so rapidly in our world that we have to understand that the students that are in our classrooms now are in a completely different world than the students that were in our classrooms even 10 to 15 years ago. We're looking at Facebook wasn't even around 10 to 15 years ago. I wasn't coming live. I couldn't have come live every Monday night to even share what was happening in my classroom. The ability to share information has totally changed. So we need to flip what's happening in our classroom to give our students a bit more autonomy and control of what they're doing, because we're not the experts. There's a lot of experts out there and they have access to them. So we need to kind of get out of their way and let them explore a little bit. So how that works in my literacy program or my writing program specifically is I give my students choice. So for example, today we sat down as a class and brainstormed the different forms of writing. I put the word writing in the center of a chart paper and I simply asked them, what kinds of things can you write? And they came up with a list of about 15 different writing forms off the top of their head of things that they could possibly write, things they've had experience writing in the past, different styles of books they have read and maybe want to try as writers, or just things that they have had previous experience with in previous grades that they also wanted to give a shot to. So they know the different forms of writing, and intrinsically a lot of them have a pretty good understanding about the difference between a romance, a horror, and an adventure story, or the fact that a newspaper article and a research report are going to have different features from a story. They might not know all the technical specifications of each one of those forms, but generally speaking, they have a pretty good general knowledge of the differences between those forms. So I got to play on that experience and help them to figure out how to write within these categories and give them the freedom to choose which categories might feel the most appropriate for their personality. I had a great conversation with a student today. She said to me, I don't think I'm a very creative person. And this was in a response to one of her friends saying, I love writing stories because I am a creative person. So we were talking about how that might translate into the things that she's going to be more inclined to write about. That maybe writing a really crazy story about flying unicorns and magical worlds and fairies and pixie dust, that might not be her style. But if that's what I was pushing her towards, it just wouldn't feel authentic. So allowing my students to choose the form of writing that they feel most comfortable with to start is definitely a component of my writing program. So getting down to kind of how that implements, when it's writer's workshop in my classroom, my students are just engaged in writing. I don't have expectations, especially at this point in the year. I don't have expectations over what it is they write, how long they write, what they write. I certainly am not expecting at this point that we're going to be completing polished and finished published copies of anything we're writing. I simply just want their authentic ideas down on paper. And I have to be really conscious of myself that I am super supportive of the risk that they are taking and the trust that they are giving me to be putting their ideas down, because that takes a lot of risk. Putting your personality, putting your ideas down on a piece of paper with a teacher that you've known for 5 days. Now, thankfully, some of my students I had them all last year. So for some of them, they're a bit further ahead in the trust factor. But for some of my new students, they've known me for 5 days. They don't know how I'm going to react to their story. They don't know if I'm going to rip it apart and tell them it's horrible. I hope they think I don't do that. But that's a lot of risk. So I'm finding for some of my newer students, I'm not necessarily getting as much as maybe I could push them to get with some of my former repeat students. So I want them just to try and get their ideas down on paper. Once I have something to work with, I can coach them to the next step. I can look at what it is that they're writing, and if they write me a list of things that's not organized into paragraphs, and it's simply just some ideas that are organized in chronological order, and it's in a list format, great. They wrote down something, I can work with that. Next step, let's put that into a paragraph where we write the sentences and the sentences are linked together instead of in a list. That's a very clear next step. From there, we're moving them forward. Okay, now that we have one paragraph, let's try an introduction sentence and a conclusion sentence. The next time you write something that is a recount, let's look at maybe adding multiple paragraphs. How could we break our ideas or add more detail about these specific events? I really look at their choosing whatever they're choosing, and then it's my job to be their coach and to push them slowly over that next step to get to becoming a far more competent writer. But that can't happen if I'm making all the decisions. So I really put it down on them. Now, I will have some students that are like, whoa, I'm not used to choice. And I would much rather somebody just tell me what to do, because there is some fear with some students that their choice is the wrong choice. Those students definitely need a little bit of extra support right now from me, because they need to be able to trust that they can put themselves out there and it's going to be okay. That they're not going to fall flat on their face, and it's a safe space for them to be able to share their ideas. And as well, for those students, I do give them, say, a choice board of 9 writing forms or topics that they could choose that would be safe choices for them if they're really, really stuck and they're not sure what to write about. Most of my students, as we go further, always choose the very center of our choice board, and that is choose your own form of writing that interests you the most. Very rarely, actually, do students choose the topics from my choice board, but they're there for those that need them. So giving student voice and choice, it sounds scary, but it's actually so much easier to manage as a teacher, because the kids are engaged, they're in control, they like what they're doing, they get excited about it. So when kids are engaged and excited and they just want to do it. Sometimes the biggest management piece I have is getting them to stop doing it, which is not a bad problem to have. I'll take that problem over behavior problems at any point. And the other issue sometimes they're really chatty because they just want to share. They're so excited about it that they want to share with their friends. So it might sound scary to completely release that control into your students' hands, but I would highly encourage you to do so and just let it ride and see how it goes. Take the risk, jump into the deep end, and you probably aren't going to sink. It'll be okay. So the second thing that I think is really important for my writing is I focus on the writing process. So in my dilemma of how is I going to reach these disengaged writers a couple of years ago, I always turn to the Guides to Effective Instruction, which are documents that help teachers in Ontario to identify what effective instruction looks like in the different strands. So we have our curriculum, but we also have this pedagogical support document that is a wealth of information. It's based on research, a variety of research. It's written by extremely smart people, and it is a wealth of information if you're struggling with how to teach anything. It's a big read, but it's definitely valuable. So one of the things I noticed is I was searching for, okay, I want to teach an adventure story. How do I teach an adventure story? So I hit the Command F. I'm on a Mac, so I think it's like Control F, where you're searching to find a word that might be in the PDF document. So I hit that and I typed in the word adventure. It didn't show up. The Guides to Effective Instruction don't actually mention teaching those specific writing forms that are in the curriculum. In fact, if you actually read Expectation Under Writing 2.1, which is form, the curriculum expectation says write more complex text using a variety of forms. That's it. That's the expectation. But then they have this other text that's examples. Like, for example, you could use a storyboard. For example, you could write a letter to the author. For example, you could do this. But those are examples. That's not actually what the curriculum is telling you have to teach. Those are just examples of things you could do to satisfy the expectation of students writing a variety of forms and complex text forms. When you go to the Guides to Effective Instruction, they like to categorize the writing into 4 categories: narrative, descriptive, persuasive, and expository. So I wanted to stick with those 4. I wanted to look at getting my students to write a variety of text forms covering those 4 general categories. I even simplify that even further for my students and breaking it down into 2, fiction and nonfiction. For narrative, I get them, there's so many different options that they can choose, and it's a really personal thing. So if I have a student that's really interested in writing fantasy, well, I let them write fantasy. Other students are interested in writing personal narratives, so I get them to write that. Some are really interested in historical fiction, so I let them write historical fiction, because that's something they're really interested in, and it allows them to embed their passions into the things they're doing. It lets them answer questions. And I think that that's a key for there, is understanding the actual curriculum expectation doesn't say thou shalt teach this form, that form, and the next form. Now, some of our school boards at some point in time had consultants that decided we would break apart the language document and say these writing forms are taught in these certain grades. That was one person's interpretation, and you can certainly follow it. My interpretation of that curriculum is it's just a matter of complex text forms, and the text forms that I choose are going to be far better served if I allow my students some flexibility within those text forms, because I want them to have that choice and that voice and the flexibility, and I'm still satisfying the curriculum. And I'm still covering various text forms. I'm just not necessarily forcing them to write. Not having them. I do encourage them to write in different text forms, but I'm not forcing them and narrowing down their creativity by deciding which specific forms they need to write in all of the time. So instead, I focus on the writing process. And this is the key for me. Regardless of what writing form a student is working on, there's a general writing process that I want them to follow. I want them to brainstorm or brain dump, or if you saw my Instagram story from last week, a nuclear idea spill, which was a creative idea from one of my students last week to call a brain dump or a brainstorming session, where students just simply write down every crazy idea that they have that relates to the story or report that they are wanting to write. So if it's a report, we're going to be looking at what questions do you have about that general topic? Write them all down. If it's a story, what crazy things do you want to include in that story? And it's simply, there is no bad options. We can edit them out later, but you dump your ideas onto a page in any order. Once your ideas are onto a page, then we can start to organize those ideas and put them into, say, a graphic organizer, or we can put them in chronological order. And this will depend on the form that the students are looking at. So I provide them with a few graphic organizers that are fairly general. So you've got a report organizer, and I have a story organizer that talks about plot. And throughout the year, I'm talking about all of these features of these various text forms as I'm teaching those, often through the oral texts that I'm reading. But we look at there being a 5-step process that good writers follow. The third step, after we've organized our ideas, we've brain dumped, we've organized our ideas, then we go on to drafting. And I stress for my students that drafting is simply about getting our ideas down on paper. That we want to take our brain dump that's been organized and we want to get that down on paper into sentences. Does it have to be perfect? No. Should it be readable? Preferably. I would prefer that the text is readable. Is there going to be spelling mistakes? Absolutely. Will there be grammar mistakes? Yep, there will be, because we're talking about students that are learning to write. But these are okay. I don't want students to stop writing in the drafting stage because they're so terrified that they're going to make a spelling mistake and that I will be evaluating their draft writing. I like to talk to my students about the difference between assessment and evaluation. An assessment is something I'm going to do along the way as I'm measuring their growth and determining what their next step is going to be and how I can help them. So do I assess all of their drafts? Absolutely. Do I make a record of their growth and their path they're moving along that trajectory? For sure. But is it evaluative? No. I wait to evaluate them closer to the end of a reporting period, where I'm actually looking at their ability to take all of the things that they've learned through the term about improving their writing and becoming a good writer and putting all of those elements of a good writer into their drafts. I carry that through and then have an evaluative piece of writing closer to the end of the reporting period. So that third step is drafting and getting down those ideas. The fourth step is editing and revising. This is done with a partner, this is done by themselves, and this is done with me as a teacher. This is a time for me to provide them feedback on the draft. The most valuable point of my job as a teacher during Writer's Workshop is to give students feedback and to tell them what their goal is for their next step. And I do this individually. It's not as a whole group, it's individual. So I have some students where I just want them to take their list and put it into a paragraph. I have some students that I'm focusing on descriptive words in their text and really getting them to come closer to getting all of their ideas on paper and writing a well thought out plot of their story. The abilities in my classroom range from like as wide as I could probably point. But my goal is to move each one of those students further. And the growth that I see, I've been doing this for a couple of years, the growth of their writing ability, their growth in their confidence as writers, their growth in their love of writing grows way more in this format than I have ever seen in any other year. I've had students that I had all year last year. They saved their writing book and brought it back to school this year because they just couldn't wait to add more information because they had a story that was in their head that they just wanted to wait until we had Writer's Workshop so that they could participate in this feedback and make it better and use it for learning. So they've been bugging me for 5 days. When could they get a full writing session? They don't want to wait. So that is gold and something I would never get prior to that. So really focusing on that writing process in the general path and giving them feedback on the elements that they can include and the improvements that they can make are key. And finally, the third thing is students need time. These are students that are beginning to learn how to write. They're just finding their voice, especially if they're in grade 4 and grade 5. This is a very pivotal time to decide whether or not writing they can express themselves in written form. And they need the support and the encouragement and ability of their teacher to push them to be the best writers that they can be. But that needs time. They're all starting at different places. And I found that a 6-week unit just simply wasn't enough time for them to gain mastery. And I was constantly starting from fresh every time I was starting a new unit because they weren't writing for themselves. They were writing just to get a mark. And it was kind of uninspired. But now I think they're writing because they do want to have that mark and prove. I wouldn't say that that motivation is gone, but more so they're writing because they're really interested in what they're writing about. And this is not all of my students. I have some students right now that are like, this lady is crazy that she's just letting me write what I want, and I can get away with a lot and not do anything. But you've got to hold them accountable, and you've got to be tough when you need to be tough, and soft when you need to be soft, and supportive when you need to be supportive, and tough love when you need some tough love. Each student will need different motivation depending on who they are as students to kind of get them to where you want to be. But they need time. It's about slow gains over this time period. It's not about the quick gains over the entire time. It's about slow baby steps all the way through. So I'm writing with a list, and then I'm writing with a paragraph, and then I'm writing with a good introduction and conclusion. Then I might be adding 2 paragraphs of my report. Then maybe I'll be writing something where I have to do a little bit of research. It's not just a report on something or a recount of something that I am personally an expert on already. Maybe I have to consult external research. Maybe with a story, it's really simple. And they have a very simple story that follows the framework, but you've got to add more detail, add more description, add dialogue, adhere to a plot better, add some excitement, work on logic, which is a key for most junior grade students. All of these are tips that I coach my students through each time I meet with them. So whenever they finish a draft, they meet with me and I coach them through what is going to be their next step, what their goals are based on where they are now. What are we going to work on next and improve? And this slow burn over the entire year actually allows me to cover way more curriculum than I've ever covered in previous systems of writing. And it gives my students the ability to see the connectedness between writing and reading. It allows them to learn from their mistakes, learn from their own experiences, build on the things that they did before. They see learning as an entire year-long journey as opposed to just something I've got to do and as a checklist to get it done because this is what my teacher's telling me to do. That kind of mindless robot working. I try to avoid that because I find that it's not really authentic learning. As an aside, I myself am an expert robot learner. And I can play the game and do what I'm supposed to do and game the system to try to figure out how to get the best mark possible with the least amount of work. I was very good at that as a student, and that's part of the reason I think I'm so passionate about putting people's personalities and giving them that voice and choice so that they're not just finding a way to game the system and learn nothing, but actually are engaged, active participants in their own learning. So I hope I've given you some food for thought on why I no longer use static units to teach writing forms, and my main 3 reasons for why I do a spiraled approach to teaching writing, and my 3 reasons why to give students a voice and choice to focus less on the forms of writing and more on the writing process, as well as to give students much, much more time for mastery and slowly build those skills over a much longer period of time instead of specific gains in a short amount of time. So all of this, again, is based on and is embedded into my literacy program, Ignited Literacy. And if you are interested in how to plan and schedule your language arts and to learn more about the entire literacy program, I will be hosting a bonus free masterclass close to the end of the month. Date has not been decided, but if you want to join the wait list, so that you can get in and learn more about how to plan and schedule your high quality language arts program that incorporates this writer's workshop format, you can sign up to be on the waitlist at www.madlylearning.com. When you go to my homepage, you're going to see 3 teal boxes right underneath my face. The middle one will link you to the sign up page so that you can join the waitlist. So once I get the date confirmed for that masterclass, you will be the very first person to know so that you can sign up and attend that workshop. So thank you so much for joining me. If you've got any questions about using that, about using this format in your writing, I am always here and available. You can reach out to me on any of my social media platforms at Madly Learning, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for watching, and we will be back again next week to talk all about using inquiry-based teaching practices in your classroom all throughout your day. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week.